Imagine yourself in the year 1500, in the heart of the Middle Ages. You have an unbearable headache. What would you do? Take some medicine. Well, if you lived back then, the treatment would be much more direct. The medieval doctor, armed with his rusty knife and no anesthesia, would look at you and say, "We're going to drill a hole in your skull." Surprised? Well, this was more common than you might think. We're talking about trepanation, a procedure so bizarre and invasive, it would make any modern horror movie look like a fairy tale. Trepanation involved drilling a hole into the patient's skull with a tool called a trepan. This tool resembled a circular saw with sharp blades that would cut straight through the skin, muscles, and, of course, the skull. And the most shocking part, the patient stayed awake during the entire process. They believed that diseases like epilepsy, mental issues, or even simple headaches were caused by pressure or evil spirits trapped in the brain. And the solution to this, make a hole in the skull to release the pressure. Surreal, right? This procedure, considered advanced at the time, was meant to release the evil trapped within the skull. And believe it or not, many people genuinely thought this would work. Doctors weren't just trying to relieve pain, they were saving lives. Or so they thought. This procedure was so popular that even nobles and the rich sought out doctors to clear their minds or prevent mental illness. Fortunately, the practice of trepanation was eventually phased out, but the fact is that for centuries, many people underwent this cruel process in the hope of a cure. What's even more shocking is that some patients survived, but with devastating consequences like brain infections, paralysis, and permanent neurological problems. In other words, the remedy was often worse than the original disease. Trepanation is one of the most iconic examples of medieval medicine, where doctors had no understanding of human anatomy like we do today, and the cure often turned into torture. In the Middle Ages, medicine was a field of experimentation and often pure cruelty. For doctors at the time, the idea of healing a patient was completely disconnected from what we understand today as comfort and care. Instead of seeking relief, many treatments were more like torture than healing. And the worst part, many of these treatments not only failed but also caused more harm than good. Imagine this, medieval medicine had no anesthesia, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of anatomy. This meant that many procedures were done brutally, with unclean instruments, and no regard for the patient's pain. The famous bloodletting, for example, was used to treat just about every disease, from colds to mental illnesses. But what these doctors didn't know was that draining a patient's blood until they fainted didn't cure them. It only made them weaker and more prone to infections. And believe me, bloodletting was just the tip of the iceberg. Some doctors believed diseases could be treated by simply removing a part of the body, like amputating limbs that were supposedly contaminated by bad humors. The patients, with no anesthesia, often had to endure these horrendous operations, screaming in pain as their limbs were chopped off with rusty blades. Another example of this torturous mentality was the practice of purging, where doctors would use extremely strong substances to force the patient to vomit or even defecate to exhaustion, believing this cleaned the humors and restored health. These practices not only caused serious physical damage but often resulted in death. This kind of medicine, where doctors thought they were helping but were actually causing more harm, is a sad reflection of the lack of scientific understanding at the time. Patients were, for the most part, treated as guinea pigs, subjected to experimental and risky treatments, all in the name of a cure that was more superstition than real science. Can you imagine that the solution to a headache could be a hole in your skull? Well, in the Middle Ages, this was the reality. Trepanation, as we discussed earlier, was seen as a magical solution for a variety of problems, especially headaches, which were believed to be a sign of evil spirits or an imbalance of the humors. In the minds of medieval doctors, if you had a headache, the problem was clear: pressure building up in the brain, and the only way to relieve that pressure was to open the skull. This procedure was horrifying, not just because it was extremely invasive, but also because the patient was fully awake during the surgery, as there was no anesthesia. The only thing the doctor might offer was a bit of wine or alcohol, but that didn't help with the excruciating pain as they drilled into the skull with rudimentary tools. The logic behind trepanation was simple and terrifying. Doctors believed that by creating a hole in the skull, they would be releasing evil spirits or excess bad humors causing the disease. In addition to headaches, this procedure was used to treat conditions like epilepsy, head injuries, mental illness, and even panic attacks. The idea was that by relieving the pressure, the person would heal. In more extreme cases, people even requested this procedure preventively, believing it would protect them from future illnesses or insanity. It was truly a practice of faith in medieval medicine where science had no idea what was happening inside the human body. Surprisingly, some people actually survived these procedures. However, these survivors often faced terrible complications like infections, seizures, and a life marked by serious neurological sickness. And if you think this was a rare practice, you're mistaken. Trepanation was performed for centuries across Europe, taught in medical schools, and carried out by even respected doctors. The worst part, many patients never knew what they were really facing, and the procedure often led to death rather than healing. At the heart of medieval medicine was a theory that, even by the standards of the time, was absolutely wrong. We are talking about the famous theory of the four humors, which was the foundation of medicine for over 1,000 years. Doctors believed that human beings were governed by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. For these doctors, health was the result of the perfect balance of these humors in the body, and disease arose when one of these humors was out of balance. Now, if you think the idea of balancing fluids in the body sounds absurd, brace yourself. Medieval medicine not only believed in this, but it structured all of its treatments around this concept. If you were sick, a medieval doctor would likely examine you to determine which humor was out of control, and the treatment, while it was simple, performed procedures like bloodletting, purging, or even inducing vomiting to try to correct this imbalance. It was almost as if by damaging your body even more, health would be restored. And of course, each humor was associated with specific personality traits. For example, a person with too much blood would be sanguine, meaning cheerful but impulsive. A person with too much phlegm would be phlegmatic, calm but lazy. People with too much yellow bile were choleric, ambitious but angry, while those with too much black bile were melancholic, artistic but depressed. Doctors believed that not only the body, but even a person's behavior could be explained by these humors. This concept was so deeply embedded in medieval medicine that questioning it was considered heresy. For the scholars of the time, learning to read these humors and their effects on the human body was essential, and any deviation was treated as a moral failure, even though we were dealing with something completely unfounded and without scientific basis. This theory remained a central pillar of medicine for centuries. Moreover, the charts and maps used by medieval doctors to determine the balance of the humors were complex and detailed. They believed that external factors like weather, food, and even planetary movements could affect these humors and, consequently, a person's health. This shows us how medieval medicine was deeply tied to superstitions and beliefs that, although widely accepted at the time, were based on a complete lack of scientific understanding of the human body. If you thought the leech was just a disgusting little insect, you're sorely mistaken. In the Middle Ages, it was considered one of the greatest allies of medicine, and contrary to what you might imagine, the use of leeches had nothing to do with any kind of effective remedy, but instead stemmed from a deeply flawed understanding of how the human body worked. Medieval doctors believed that by draining a person's blood with the help of leeches, they could restore the balance of the humors. If you were sick with a fever, headache, digestive issues, or even mental disturbances, the solution was simple. Place leeches on the body. They would be applied to various parts of the body and suck the blood until they were swollen and saturated. The idea was that the bad blood would be extracted, leaving the person healthier. The practice was seen as a natural cure and was considered modern, even adopted by the most respected doctors of the time. No matter the condition, leeches were the solution. What's most shocking, however, is that the leeches did nothing to treat the illness. They were simply an instrument of superstition, and the fact that doctors thought they were doing good for the patient didn't make the process any less inhumane. In some cases, leeches were used so excessively that the person would faint from weakness due to blood loss. A notable example of this is King Charles II of England, who had much of his health compromised by this type of treatment. Doctors used leeches and performed excessive bloodletting, which ultimately worsened his condition. The medications and practices of the time, like the leech, were done with complete confidence. But the reality was that these cures ended up being fatal. Even though it was a deeply wrong and cruel practice, the use of leeches didn't disappear immediately. They remained part of medical treatment until the late 19th century, when medicine finally began to question this archaic and dangerous practice. Only then did it become clear that the benefits of the leech were entirely imaginary, and that rather than healing, it only worsened the health of the patients. Now, get ready for one of the most macabre and bizarre remedies medieval medicine had to offer: mummies. Yes, you read that right. We're not talking about natural remedies or mystical potions, but about human remains from Egyptian mummies that were ground into powder and used as a miraculous medicine. It might sound like a horror story, but in the Middle Ages, it was a fairly common practice. These remedies were called mumia, and the concept behind their use was based on a completely distorted belief that the mummy, as a preserved body, carried a vital energy that could cure various ailments. Doctors believed that the power of the preservation of mummies had the ability to heal everything from simple headaches to more serious conditions like bruises, fractures, and even chronic diseases. For many, consuming mummy powder was a sacred healing ritual. Apothecaries, medieval pharmacists, would buy these mummies in markets and process them to sell as high-value medication. This medicine was so popular among the nobility and the rich that they paid fortunes to acquire a jar of mummy powder, which could be ingested or applied to wounds depending on the ailment. For many, this was a miraculous cure, a guaranteed remedy for any illness. The most disturbing part: the mummy market was a real business, with people hunting for bodies to obtain the mummies and sell them as medicinal products. The concept of curing with body parts didn't stop there. In addition to mummy powder, it was also common to use other cadaveric elements, like bones of the dead and even the blood of executed criminals, which were sold as treatments for diseases. The worst part is that these corpse-based remedies were believed to be highly effective, and many people thought that by taking a little of the vital energy from these preserved bodies, they could heal from almost anything. Fortunately, the practice of using mummies as medicine faded over time, but the fact that, for centuries, doctors genuinely believed that mummy powder had healing powers makes us reflect on how far removed medieval medicine was from scientific reality. If you think urine tests today are uncomfortable, get ready for the idea of a medieval diagnosis, where the doctor not only looked at your urine, but actually tasted it. Yes, that's right, at the height of medieval medicine. One of the most respected and effective diagnostic methods was the so-called uroscopy, or urine examination. And if you think that sounds strange, wait until you hear the details of how it was done. For medieval doctors, urine was seen as a window into the human body. They believed that urine could reveal not only the physical state of the patient, but also their character and temperament. The diagnosis was a complex process. Doctors used special flasks called metulas, which were used to collect the urine and then examine its characteristics. The color, consistency, transparency, and even the smell of the urine were analyzed with great seriousness. But that wasn't all. The most impressive and truly disgusting part of the examination involved the doctor tasting the urine. And no, it wasn't just a simple tasting to check the quality or freshness of the liquid. Doctors believed that the taste of urine revealed crucial information about the patient's health. For example, if the urine was sweet, it indicated diabetes. If it was bitter, it suggested liver problems. And if it was salty, it was a clear sign of kidney disease. Believe it or not, doctors spent years training to recognize the specific tastes of urine, as if it were as accurate as modern lab tests. And don't think this was done casually. The urine examination was a respected practice, carried out by doctors trained at medieval universities. The most renowned doctors became famous for their ability to diagnose diseases just by tasting urine. Often, patients were never seen in person by the doctor, who simply made a remote diagnosis based on the taste sent to them. While today this method seems at least repulsive and scientifically incorrect, in the Middle Ages, it was treated with extreme seriousness, and the worst part, this practice continued in use for much longer, being part of medical curricula until the early 19th century. When medicine failed, which, let's face it, happened often in the Middle Ages, faith took the stage, not just as an emotional support for patients, but as a legitimate treatment, a solution for diseases and even death. At a time when science was just beginning to understand the human body, religion was seen as the true answer to health. And that meant saints, relics, and even prayers were integral parts of the medical process. Medieval doctors didn't hesitate to prescribe pilgrimages to shrines or recommend the use of sacred relics to cure patients, instead of a chemical remedy or practical treatment. The treatment could simply be a direct request to God, through devotion to a specific saint. For instance, if you had vision problems, you'd be recommended to visit the shrine of Saint Lucy, who was considered the patron saint of eyesight. If you suffered from epilepsy, you'd be sent to the tomb of Saint Vitus, who was believed to cure this condition. In addition to pilgrimages, another commonly prescribed method was the use of holy relics, pieces of saints, bodies, or objects they had touched. Many believed that simply touching a piece of a saint's bones or using a fragment of their clothing could heal diseases that medicine could not reach. Relics were treated as objects of great power, and churches and monasteries fiercely competed to possess the most important ones. The cure didn't come from medications, but from the divine energy that these objects represented. It wasn't uncommon for the most respected doctors of the time to collaborate with monks and clergy, recommending the use of relics or even sending their patients to churches so that the healing saint could intercede for them. Additionally, many doctors saw these practices not as superstition, but as a way to balance science with divine faith, believing that healing was both a physical and spiritual matter. In some cases, people would spend weeks or even months performing healing rituals such as praying, fasting, or sleeping next to a sacred relic, hoping to be cured. And, interestingly, many truly believed these rituals worked, especially if someone sick recovered soon after completing the ritual. This type of divine healing remained highly sought after and, for a long time, had more credibility than any traditional medical treatment. Medieval medicine, although grotesque and full of flaws, had a deep and lasting influence on the development of medicine as we know it today. Many of the practices that we now consider absurd or inhumane were in fact tentative steps in trying to understand and treat the human body, even with limited knowledge. What medieval medicine leaves us with is a history of trial and error, where the failures were many, but the impact on the evolution of human health was undeniable. Doctors of the Middle Ages, despite their archaic beliefs and bizarre treatments, were pioneers in some important aspects of medicine. For example, the idea that diseases had specific causes and could be treated based on symptoms was a foundational principle for the development of medical sciences in the following centuries. Although their theories were completely incorrect, such as the theory of the four humors, The concept of relating symptoms to diseases persisted and led to what we now call diagnosis. In addition, the first medical universities that emerged in Europe during the Middle Ages were fundamental to the professionalization of medicine. These centers of learning were responsible for transmitting the medical knowledge of the time, which, although often wrong, laid the foundations for the education of future doctors. This educational structure helped transform medicine from an empirical and superstitious field into something closer to the scientific foundations we see today. However, the darkest legacy of medieval medicine can be found in the devastating treatments that were used in the name of healing, such as trepanation, bloodletting, and the use of leeches. Although these practices were based on wrong ideas, they reveal how humans have always sought to solve their afflictions, even in cruel and harmful ways. For this reason, medieval medicine, with all its violence and ignorance, teaches us a fundamental lesson: the value of knowledge and scientific research in the search for a cure. Today, when we look at modern medicine, we cannot deny that it was, in a way, shaped by the trials, failures, and successes of medieval medicine. While treatments today are far more effective, the human struggle to understand and treat diseases began long before we knew what was actually going on inside the human body. Medieval medicine, as flawed as it was, is one of the roots from which the advancements that finally began saving lives effectively and ethically grew. As much as medieval medicine was marked by grotesque mistakes and practices that bordered on torture, it is important to understand how this era was essential for the advancements in modern medicine. The transition from medieval medicine to modern medicine was not a sudden leap, but rather a gradual process filled with frustrating attempts, superstitions, and of course, a few valuable discoveries that survived the test of time. With the Renaissance, which occurred between the 15th and 16th centuries, came a wave of intellectual renewal. Science began to move away from theology and superstition that dominated the Middle Ages. The first anatomists and doctors, like Andreas Vesalius, started conducting dissections on the human body to study anatomy in a more detailed and accurate way. These scholars were pioneers in establishing the foundations of modern anatomy, challenging the fallacies of medieval medicine that had reigned unquestioned for centuries. However, it was the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries that truly sparked a radical change in how medicine was practiced. William Harvey, with his theory of blood circulation, and Edward Jenner, who discovered the smallpox vaccine, were just some of the scientists who revolutionized medicine by focusing on scientific observation and experimentation. What was once based on superstitions, relics, and religious rituals began to give way to systematic studies, laboratory methods, and a scientific look at the human body. Still, medieval medicine left lasting marks. The first medical universities, which emerged in the Middle Ages, were the birthplace of medical education and laid the foundations for the rigorous training of modern doctors. Moreover, the idea that healing could be achieved through knowledge and practical experience rather than pure faith or superstition was one of the greatest lessons passed down by this era. Today, modern medicine is built on a solid scientific foundation, with technologies that allow for precise treatments and cures for diseases that, in the Middle Ages, would have been fatal. However, the journey of medicine is a reminder that even the most grotesque mistakes and the darkest periods of medical history play a crucial role in the progress of the sciences and in how we approach health.